They said my tennis court was now community property, but they never expected I'd show up at their HOA meeting with government auditor credentials and 5 years of their suspicious financial records. How exactly will Margaret Whitfield explain the $155,000 in landscape and consultation fees paid to her sister's company while she was busy organizing tennis tournaments on my private court? I still remember the exact moment when everything changed in our quiet neighborhood of Cedar Grove, California. Standing in my kitchen, coffee in hand, I watched through the window as strangers walked confidently across my backyard toward my tennis court. Not just one person, but a group of 5 carrying rackets and coolers like they owned the place. "Excuse me," I called out, rushing outside in my slippers. "This is private property." A well-dressed woman with perfectly highlighted hair turned slowly, eyebrows raised as if I were the one intruding. "Oh, you must be the new homeowner. I'm Margaret Whitfield, HOA president." Her smile didn't reach her eyes. "We have Tuesday morning tennis here. It's in the community guidelines." I felt my face heat. I've read every page of those guidelines. There's nothing about my personal tennis court being community property. Margaret tilted her head, her group watching with amused expressions. "Perhaps you missed Addendum C. The previous owner agreed to community access. It's all very official." She flicked her wrist dismissively. "You can take it up at the next board meeting if you'd like. First Thursdays, 7 p.m. sharp." As they continued on to my court, my $35,000 investment that had sealed the deal on purchasing this home, I stood frozen in disbelief. The sound of tennis balls hitting my freshly resurfaced court echoed like tiny explosions of anger in my chest. I spent the next 3 days digging through every document from my home purchase. Nothing mentioned shared court access. My realtor sounded equally confused when I called. "That wasn't in any disclosure," she insisted. "I would have told you if there were easements or shared amenities." The following Tuesday brought more uninvited players. Wednesday afternoon, a youth tennis class appeared, coached by Margaret's husband, Thomas Whitfield. Thursday morning, I returned from grocery shopping to find an actual tournament underway, complete with a folding table serving as a refreshment stand on my patio. I approached one young mother who seemed less entrenched in whatever was happening. "Do you know anything about this arrangement? Was this court really shared before I bought the house?" She glanced nervously toward Margaret before whispering, "We've only lived here 8 months, but we were told all amenities are shared. Margaret's very particular about this court. She had one at her previous home, but downsized last year." With an apologetic smile, she hurried away. That night, I attended the HOA meeting armed with my closing documents and property maps. 12 neighbors sat in folding chairs in Margaret's expansive living room. Her walls displayed photos of tennis competitions, and trophies stood proudly on a dedicated shelf. "Next item," Margaret announced when I raised my hand. "Our new neighbor has concerns about community tennis access." "It's not a concern," I said firmly. "It's a property rights issue. There is no recorded easement agreement or covenant that permits community use of my private tennis court." Margaret's smile tightened. "Addendum C clearly outlines." "I'd like to see this mysterious Addendum C," I interrupted, "because it wasn't in my closing documents, it's not registered with the Cedar County Records Office, and my realtor confirms it doesn't exist." The room fell silent. A balding man in the back, introduced as HOA Treasurer Harold Bennett, shuffled through a binder. "Perhaps there was an administrative oversight," he suggested weakly. Let me be perfectly clear, I said, making eye contact with each board member. I purchased my home with a private tennis court. I have exclusive rights to that amenity. Any further trespassing will be handled accordingly. Margaret's face hardened. We've always had access to that court, always. The previous owner understood community spirit. Did they? I asked, because I had spoken with them yesterday, or at least that's what I implied. Her momentary flash of panic confirmed my suspicion. This wasn't an oversight, it was an intentional overreach. As I walked home that night, my neighbor Frank Miller called out from his porch. "Bold move standing up to Margaret. Just watch your back. Last guy who crossed her suddenly had violation notices every week until he moved." Over the next week, peace returned to my backyard. Then came the certified letter. Multiple violations noted during a recent property inspection. The list included ridiculous items, non-compliant shade of white on the tennis court lines, and recreational equipment exceeding height restrictions. When I pulled into my driveway that evening, I found Margaret measuring my court fence with a tape measure. She didn't even pretend to be embarrassed. "Just confirming measurements for the violation report," she said. "This has to stop," I said quietly. "Actually, it's just beginning," she replied. "Board meeting voted last night. Fines start Monday, $100 per day per violation." I laughed, which clearly wasn't the reaction she expected. "Interesting timing," I said, "considering the board is only authorized to meet on the first Thursday of each month unless there's an emergency meeting with 72 hours notice to all homeowners. I received no such notice." Her smile faltered briefly before returning. "Administrative oversight. We'll resend." That weekend, I installed security cameras covering my entire backyard. Monday morning, my doorbell rang. A Cedar County official stood there with a clipboard. "Got a complaint about unpermitted structure modifications, something about a tennis court not matching approved plans." I smiled. "Perfect timing. I'd like to file a complaint as well." What Margaret Whitfield couldn't have known was that I worked as a compliance auditor for the Cedar County Planning Department. I wasn't just familiar with housing regulations, I helped enforce them. And something about this entire situation felt very, very wrong. Light rain tapped against the window of my home office as I spread documents across my desk. 3 weeks had passed since Margaret's county inspection gambit had backfired spectacularly. The inspector, my colleague Miguel, had found nothing wrong with my tennis court, but had noticed several interesting discrepancies in Margaret's own property records. "You won't believe what I found," I told my sister over the phone, scanning through emails from the Cedar County Records Office. Margaret's been HOA president for 6 years, even though the bylaws clearly state a 4-year maximum term. And guess who amended those bylaws? The board she personally appointed, right after the last elected members mysteriously all resigned within months of each other. My doorbell interrupted our conversation. A nervous-looking man in his 60s stood on my porch, glancing repeatedly over his shoulder. "Sorry to bother you," he said quietly. "I'm Harold Bennett. I was HOA treasurer until last year." I invited him in, offering coffee, which he declined with shaky hands. "I saw what's happening with your tennis court situation. It's not the first time." Harold explained how Margaret had systematically targeted homes with desirable features: a workshop, a greenhouse, even a specialized garden, gradually claiming them for community use through manipulated bylaws and selective enforcement of rules. "Why did you resign?" I asked. Harold stared into his lap. "Financial discrepancies I couldn't explain. Association fees increased 3 times during my tenure, but our accounts never reflected the additional income. When I questioned it, Margaret suggested I might be getting too stressed for the position." His voice dropped. "Then my wife started receiving violation notices for her garden daily. We got the message." I showed him the documents I'd gathered. His eyes widened at the pattern emerging. "You need to see the storage facility," he whispered. "Unit 23 at Cedar Grove Safe Lock Storage. That's where they keep the real records." My phone buzzed with an email notification. The Cedar County Recorder had sent the property assessment history for Cedar Grove. Margaret's home value had somehow decreased 3 years in a row, while everyone else's increased, resulting in significantly lower property taxes for her. That afternoon, I visited Safe Lock Storage under the pretense of renting a unit. While the manager showed me available options, I spotted a familiar face exiting Unit 23, the balding HOA board member from the meeting. He carried a banker's box to his car, looking nervously around the parking lot. I followed at a safe distance, watching him deliver the box to Margaret's house. Through her front window, I could see them spreading documents across her dining table with 2 other board members. They appeared agitated, occasionally pointing toward my house visible down the street. "Time for a different approach," I muttered, driving to the Cedar County Administration Building. Using my employee access, I requested historical aerial photographs of the neighborhood. What I found confirmed my growing suspicion. My tennis court had been built only 4 years ago, well after Margaret had become HOA president, and records showed no community use provision had ever been filed. The next morning, a construction crew arrived outside my house. "Landscape modification for the Cedar Grove Community Tennis Facility," the foreman explained, showing me a work order signed by Margaret. I called the police while filming the crew attempting to remove a section of my fence. Officer Ramirez arrived quickly, having dealt with HOA disputes before. "This appears to be a civil matter," he began, until I showed him my property survey and deed. "There's nothing civil about trespassing and property damage," I countered, pointing to the now mangled fence section. "And I'd like to press charges." The workers, realizing they'd been caught in the middle of something questionable, packed up hastily. As they left, Margaret's SUV screeched into my driveway. She emerged like a thundercloud, designer sunglasses hiding what I imagined were furious eyes. "You've made a serious mistake," she hissed, ignoring Officer Ramirez. "The board has unanimously voted to place a lien on your property for unpaid violation fees." Officer Ramirez stepped forward. "Ma'am, we're currently investigating potential criminal trespassing and vandalism. I'd advise you to leave these premises." Margaret's composure cracked slightly. "This is HOA business. The police have no jurisdiction in covenant enforcement." Ramirez replied calmly, "Destruction of private property falls squarely under our jurisdiction." After they left, I knew this wasn't over. I received a text from an unknown number. "Tomorrow, 7 p.m. Others who want to help, come alone." It was signed simply F. I assumed it was Frank Miller. When I arrived, the community center was mostly empty except for 7 uneasy-looking residents gathered in the far corner. I recognized a few faces from around the neighborhood, though we had never spoken before. A woman introduced herself as Diane Carter, former chair of the landscaping committee. Margaret forced me out when I questioned the expenses, $20,000 for seasonal plantings that never even appeared. Others spoke up with similar stories: selective enforcement of rules, unexplained fees, and retaliation against anyone who challenged the board. Frank came in last, carrying a small thumb drive. Financial records from the past 5 years, he explained. I made copies before I left. Turns out Margaret's sister owns the landscaping company that's received over $200,000 in HOA contracts. The so-called tennis court maintenance alone, he paused, locking eyes with me, supposedly costs $35,000 a year for a court that, until recently, wasn't even community property. We laid out a plan. I would handle legal documentation and county violation reports. Diane would start a petition for a special election. Others would gather proof of selective enforcement and financial misconduct. As the meeting wrapped up, headlights swept across the windows. Through the blinds, we spotted Margaret's SUV slowly circling the parking lot. "She's watching us," Diane whispered. "Good," I said, "because we're watching her too." The next morning, I found my car windshield shattered, a tennis ball lying among the glass shards. A note under my wiper read, "Accidents happen when you play dangerous games." I photographed everything before calling the police. While waiting, I noticed something about the tennis ball. It wasn't like the premium ones I owned. On closer inspection, I recognized the custom logo. It was from Margaret's personal collection, visible in those trophy photos in her living room. Sometimes anger makes people sloppy, and this was her first big mistake. Later, I met Dominic at a small cafe. He slid the USB drive across the table, glancing toward the door every time it opened. "They targeted you on purpose," he whispered. "I wouldn't be telling you this if I hadn't seen what they did to the Johnson family last year." "What exactly am I looking at?" I asked, pocketing the drive. "Margaret and her crew have been running this playbook for years. They find properties with something they want, pools, tennis courts, high-end gardens, then they change the rules to take them." Back home, I plugged in the drive with shaking hands. Dozens of folders appeared, each labeled with a property address. I opened mine first. Photos of my tennis court from every angle, construction estimates, a timeline titled Community Acquisition Plan. There were emails dated 6 months before I'd even bought my house. "Found the perfect new target property," Margaret had written. "Professional-grade tennis court, east-facing, minimal neighbor visibility. New owner has no HOA experience. Should be easy to pressure once bylaws are updated." Another email read, "Remember everyone, refer to it as the community court in all conversations. Perception becomes reality." The files included annotated maps of my property, showing fence weak points, schedules for casual tennis gatherings to establish community use precedent, and budget notes for legal defense if I resisted. The worst document of all, Phase 2, Property Acquisition. When violation fines accumulate sufficiently, we can leverage for complete sale. Location perfect for future clubhouse expansion. I was still pacing my living room when I saw a familiar figure outside. Thomas Whitfield, Margaret's husband, photographing my front yard and jotting notes on a clipboard. My phone buzzed. It was a message from Sophia Bennett, my neighbor across the street who had always been unexpectedly kind. You need to come over now. Inside her house, she closed the blinds. I've been watching what they're doing to you, she said, her voice trembling. They did it to us 3 years ago, our backyard pizza oven. Why are you helping me? Aren't you afraid? I asked. Because my husband lost his job defending our property. The stress. Her voice cracked. He had a heart attack last year. Margaret sent flowers with a note saying they'd respect our privacy now, like she was doing us a favor. Sophia's teenage daughter brought in lemonade. Mom stood up at a meeting last month when they started talking about your tennis court, she said proudly. She got shouted down. There are more of us, Sophia explained. People tired of Margaret's reign, but we need proof and someone they can't bully. Someone like a government auditor, I said slowly. Her eyes widened. You didn't tell me. Brand new assignment, I smiled faintly. I start tomorrow. Sophia's smile grew. Then this changes everything. I returned home feeling both re-energized and wary. Checking my security cameras, I noticed 3 different HOA board members casually strolling past my property during the day. My phone buzzed, an HOA email blast announcing an exciting Cedar Grove Community Court Improvement Project starting tomorrow. Attached was a permit I had never approved. We're pleased to announce expansion work beginning on our community tennis facility, the email read. Please avoid the construction area. I immediately called Cedar Grove City Hall, but the offices were closed. My call to the after-hours line led nowhere. The permits appeared properly filed in their system. That night, I barely slept. At dawn, the sound of engines rumbled outside. Peering through the blinds, I saw construction trucks pulling up, workers unloading equipment. Margaret Whitfield stood in the driveway, directing traffic, clipboard in hand, wearing a hard hat with Project Manager printed across the front. I threw on clothes and raced outside. A worker was measuring my garden wall. "Stop this immediately," I shouted, stepping into his path. The foreman looked puzzled. "Ma'am, we have permits right here for community expansion work." Margaret strolled over, 3 board members trailing behind her. That smug smile on her face made my blood boil. "Good morning," she called cheerfully, as if we were meeting for coffee. "We never discussed destroying my property," I said firmly, noticing neighbors beginning to gather. "Actually," Margaret replied, her smile tightening, "it was covered under new business, item 7. The minutes were approved unanimously." Harold Bennett appeared with a tall man in an expensive suit. "This is Jeffrey Douglas, our association attorney," Margaret announced. "He's here to ensure everything proceeds smoothly." The attorney stepped forward. "We've documented 17 separate violations on your property over the past 60 days, he announced loudly, making sure the neighbors could hear. "This expansion is fully within our rights according to Section 12.4 of the covenants you signed." "I never signed permission for construction," I shot back. "Your purchase agreement included consent to all HOA regulations," he replied smoothly, "including the amendments passed last quarter." I thought back. The routine updates they'd mailed in a 50-page legal packet last spring. Margaret gestured toward my tennis court. "The community has voted. Expansion begins today." She handed me a thick envelope. Inside were copies of violation notices totaling $14,500 in fines, due within 7 days. The neighbors murmured. Some looked uneasy, but most avoided my gaze. Margaret had cultivated an atmosphere of fear perfectly. Just as the bulldozer roared to life, I played my card. "Actually, Margaret," I said calmly, reaching into my bag, "you might want to know something before you break ground." I pulled out my government credentials. As of yesterday, I'm the assigned federal auditor for all HOA financial practices in Cedar County. My very first case, reviewing 5 years of Cedar Grove HOA's financial records, including every special project you've managed. The color drained from Margaret's face. The attorney froze mid-sentence. The crowd went silent. "Construction is postponed," I announced, "and I suggest everyone keep their distance from my property while I conduct my investigation. Those permits will need verification before any work begins. I've already flagged them for review." As I headed back toward my house, my phone rang. My supervisor's voice was tense. "There's been a request to remove you from the Cedar Grove audit," he said flatly, citing a conflict of interest. My heart sank. "Margaret already?" I asked. "The request came from someone with significant political connections," he continued. "Someone who doesn't want you looking at those books. I'm assigning you a partner. Starting tomorrow, you'll have backup. This is now a priority investigation." The next morning, heavy knocking jolted me awake at 6:15 a.m. Through my peephole, I saw a tall woman in a crisp suit holding up a government ID. "Agent Marissa Reyes," she said when I opened the door. "Financial crimes. Your supervisor tells me you've stirred up quite the hornet's nest." "That's putting it mildly," I replied, inviting her in. "Coffee?" "Already had 3 cups," she said, unloading a laptop and several folders on my dining table. "So you're the homeowner and the auditor they tried to steamroll. That's either terrible luck or perfect timing." I poured myself a cup as Marissa arranged her materials with military precision. "I pulled every record I could access overnight," she explained. "Cedar Grove HOA has been flagged twice before for audit inconsistencies, but the cases mysteriously disappeared." "Disappeared?" I echoed. "Reassigned, buried, eventually dropped," she said evenly. "Someone's protecting them, which makes me very, very curious." We spent hours combing through documents, including those from Frank Miller's USB drive. Marissa took meticulous notes, occasionally letting out a low whistle. "This is textbook financial manipulation," she observed, pointing to a series of transfers. "They're funneling money through their special projects account into personal businesses. Classic laundering." The doorbell rang. On my porch stood Sophia. I returned home feeling both energized and cautious. Checking my security cameras, I noticed 3 different board members had casually walked past my property earlier in the day. My phone buzzed again, an HOA email blast announcing an exciting Cedar Grove Community Court improvement project starting tomorrow. Attached was a permit I had never approved. "We're pleased to announce expansion work beginning on our community tennis facility," the email read. "Please avoid the construction area for safety." I immediately called the Cedar County Records Office, but the offices were closed. The after-hours line was useless. On their end, the permits appeared properly filed. That night, I barely slept. At dawn, I heard engines outside. Peering through the blinds, I saw construction trucks arriving, workers unloading equipment. Margaret Whitfield stood directing traffic, clipboard in hand, a hard hat with "Project Manager" emblazoned across it. I threw on clothes and rushed outside just as a worker began measuring my garden wall. "Stop this immediately!" I shouted, stepping in front of him. The foreman looked puzzled. "Ma'am, we have permits right here for community expansion work." Margaret strolled over, 3 board members trailing behind. The smug smile on her face made my blood boil. "Good morning," she called cheerfully, as if we were meeting for brunch. "We're just implementing the improvements we discussed at last month's meeting." "We never discussed destroying my property," I said firmly, noticing neighbors gathering to watch. "Actually," Margaret's smile tightened, "it was covered under new business, item 7. The minutes were approved unanimously." Thomas Whitfield appeared with a sharply dressed man in an expensive suit. "This is Jeffrey Douglas, our association attorney," Margaret said smoothly. "He's here to ensure everything proceeds without issue." Douglas stepped forward. "We've documented 17 separate violations on your property over the past 60 days, he announced loudly, making sure the crowd could hear. "This expansion is fully within our rights, according to Section 12.4 of the covenants you signed." "I never gave permission for construction," I countered. "Your purchase agreement included consent to all HOA regulations," Douglas replied, "including amendments passed last quarter." My mind raced. The amendment they'd buried in a 50-page packet of legal jargon labeled routine updates. Margaret gestured toward my tennis court. "The community has voted. The expansion begins today." She handed me a thick envelope. "These are copies of violation notices totaling $14,500 in fines. Payment is due in 7 days." Neighbors murmured. Some looked uneasy, but most avoided eye contact. Margaret had cultivated this climate of fear masterfully. Just as the bulldozer's engine roared to life, I played my card. "Actually, Margaret," I said calmly, pulling something from my bag, "you should know something before you break ground." I revealed my government credentials. "As of yesterday, I'm the assigned federal auditor for all HOA financial practices in this county. My first case, reviewing 5 years of Cedar Grove HOA financial records, including all your special projects." The color drained from Margaret's face. The attorney froze mid-sentence. The crowd went silent. "Construction is postponed," I announced, "and I suggest everyone keep their distance from my property while I conduct my investigation." Turning to the workers, I added, "Those permits will need verification before any work begins. I've already flagged them for review." As I walked back toward my house, my phone rang. It was my supervisor. "There's been a request to remove you from the Cedar Grove audit," he said without preamble, citing conflict of interest. My heart sank. Had Margaret already outmaneuvered me? "The request came from someone with significant political connections," he continued, "someone who doesn't want you looking at those books. I'm assigning you a partner starting tomorrow. This is now a priority investigation." The next morning, heavy knocking jolted me awake at 6:15 a.m. Through the peephole, I saw a tall woman in a crisp suit, government ID held up to the glass. "Agent Marissa Reyes," she introduced herself. "Financial crimes. Your supervisor tells me you've stirred up quite the hornet's nest." "That's putting it mildly," I replied, letting her in. "Coffee?" "Already had 3 cups," she said, setting her laptop and several folders on my dining table. So, you're both the homeowner and the auditor they tried to steamroll. That's either terrible luck or perfect timing. I poured myself coffee as Marissa arranged her materials with military precision. I pulled every record I could access overnight, she explained. Cedar Grove HOA has been flagged twice before for audit inconsistencies, but the cases mysteriously disappeared. Disappeared, I echoed. Reassigned, buried, eventually dropped. She met my eyes. Someone's protecting them. And I'm very, very curious. We spent hours reviewing documents, including those from Dominic's USB drive. Marissa's pen flew across the pages, occasionally punctuated by a low whistle. This is textbook financial manipulation, she observed, pointing out a series of transfers. They're moving money through the special projects account into personal businesses. Classic laundering setup. My doorbell rang. On my porch stood Sophia with 3 neighbors I recognized but had never spoken to. With 3 neighbors I recognized but had never spoken to, we gathered after Sophia announced, after what happened yesterday, people are finally ready to talk. For the next hour, my living room turned into Witness Central. Martin Green from 2 streets over described how his koi pond had been reclassified as a community water feature. Elderly Mrs. Fernandez tearfully explained how threats of daily fines had forced her to remove the wheelchair ramp for her husband. Each story followed the same pattern. Margaret Whitfield's HOA board identifying attractive property features, manipulating rules to seize control, then leveraging violations to force compliance. It's not just about amenities, Marissa Collins concluded after they left. It's about property values and control. Margaret's real estate company handles most resales in Cedar Grove. She's creating premium community features using other people's property, then selling houses at inflated prices because of those amenities. My phone buzzed, a text from an unknown number. Emergency HOA meeting tonight at 7. Margaret says you're making false accusations. Better be there. The Cedar Grove Community Center was packed with more residents than I'd ever seen at a meeting. Margaret sat at the center table with her board members and attorney, looking composed but with tension flickering in her eyes. "We've called this emergency session," she began, "to address malicious allegations being spread by a homeowner with a personal vendetta against this board." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. "She refuses to share her tennis court like everyone else shares their amenities," Margaret continued. "She's abusing her government position to threaten and intimidate volunteers who serve this community." Her attorney rose next. "We filed a formal complaint regarding this conflict of interest. In the meantime, we ask for community support as we continue our planned improvements." I noticed Margaret's confident smile as several residents nodded. She thought she had won. Marissa and I exchanged glances. Time to change strategy. I raised my hand and was reluctantly acknowledged. "I understand concerns about conflict of interest," I began calmly. "That's why Agent Reyes from Financial Crimes has been assigned as an independent investigator." Gasps rippled through the room. Marissa stepped forward, "And that's why we've brought these." We unveiled large poster boards showing neighborhood maps with certain areas highlighted in red. "These," I explained, "are privately owned properties Margaret's board has systematically reclassified as community features over the past 5 years." People crowded forward, spotting their homes on the maps. My gazebo is marked, someone called out. Added another. Before Margaret could respond, Marissa pressed on. We've also identified approximately $347,000 in questionable transfers from HOA accounts to businesses connected to board members. The attorney jumped to his feet. These accusations are outrageous. We demand. Would anyone like to explain, I cut in, why the HOA paid $58,000 for water feature maintenance to a company owned by Thomas Whitfield, for water features that actually belong to private homeowners who maintain them themselves? The room erupted. Margaret banged her gavel, shouting for order. Suddenly, the back doors opened and a local news crew entered. Perfect timing, the reporter said as cameras rolled. We received an anonymous tip about financial irregularities and property rights violations. Care to comment, Mrs. Whitfield? Margaret's face twisted with fury. This meeting is closed to the press. Security. But the community security guards simply stepped aside. HOA bylaws require meetings to be open to the public unless a privacy vote is held, Marissa reminded the room. Has such a vote occurred? The secretary shook her head. For the next hour, residents lined up to speak, pouring out years of frustration. Margaret's support crumbled before our eyes. When Thomas Whitfield suddenly stood and left, I nodded to Marissa. She followed discreetly and returned minutes later with Dominic Harris, the former treasurer, clutching a laptop. Thomas was attempting to delete files from the HOA server, she announced. Fortunately, we secured the data. Margaret's voice had lost its edge. You can't just... As a federal agent, Marissa interrupted, I'm informing you that removing or destroying financial records during an active investigation is obstruction of justice. Margaret slumped as her attorney whispered in her ear. An elderly man stood. My wife and I have lived here 30 years. We don't care about property values if it means being afraid of our neighbors. I move for an immediate vote of no confidence in this board. I called Sophia, the HOA secretary, who looked at Margaret Whitfield's furious face and hesitated before speaking. Technically, according to the bylaws, we'd either need to record the motion, Marissa said firmly, or explain to federal investigators why proper procedure is being obstructed. Hands shot up, overwhelmingly in favor of removing the board. I felt a tap on my shoulder. A young family stood behind me. We almost bought a house here last month, the father said quietly. Margaret's real estate company showed us around, bragging about the tennis courts and community amenities. When I asked about membership fees, she said they were surprisingly low because of efficient management. Did you sign anything? I asked. We were about to, the mother replied. Then we saw the news crew outside and decided to attend tonight's meeting first. Margaret's real estate business, another thread to pull. A motion Marissa over as the meeting dissolved into plans for emergency board elections. We need to check how many houses she sold using other people's property as selling points, I whispered. Already on it, Marissa nodded. I froze the HOA accounts pending investigation. Outside, as residents lingered in heated discussion, Margaret pushed through the crowd toward me, her face twisted with anger. You've destroyed everything I built, she hissed. This community was nothing before I took over. You built it by stealing from your neighbors, I replied calmly. You'll regret this, she threatened, glancing toward my tennis court in the distance. That court was never up to code anyway. One called a building inspection. Actually, a voice interrupted behind us. I've already inspected it. We turned to see the Cedar County building inspector. Mr. Reyes contacted my office this afternoon. Everything's perfectly up to code. Margaret stormed off toward her waiting husband. As they drove away, Sophia approached with a group of neighbors. "We're having an impromptu gathering at my place," she said, "to celebrate and plan next steps. Community building, the real kind. Will you come?" Looking at their hopeful faces, I realized something had shifted. These weren't just houses on the same street anymore. Margaret had accidentally created what she claimed to want, a true community, united against her tactics. First, I smiled, would anyone be interested in a friendly game of tennis? My court is open to guests, real guests, not trespassers. As we walked toward my house, my phone rang. It was my supervisor again. "You've kicked quite the hornet's nest," he said. "The mayor just called me personally." My heart sank. "Are we being pulled off the case?" "Quite the opposite," he replied. "Seems Margaret's husband does landscaping for several government buildings. The mayor wants to make sure there's no connection to city contracts." This investigation just got bigger. "How much bigger?" I asked, watching my neighbors laugh together for what seemed like the first time. "Let's just say you might want to clear your calendar for the next few months. This could go all the way to the state level." As we reached my tennis court, I spotted a familiar face lurking near my property line. Jeffrey Douglas, Margaret's attorney, taking photos with his phone. Our eyes met. He didn't look away. This wasn't over yet. Water dripped from my hair as I stood shivering in my kitchen. The emergency sprinklers Margaret had installed without permission had accidentally activated while I was reviewing evidence at my desk near the window. My waterproof laptop displayed an email from the county inspector's office. "Your request for emergency property line verification has been approved. Inspection scheduled for tomorrow at 9 a.m. My phone rang. Dominic's voice came through, hushed and worried. "They've called an emergency board meeting tonight. My neighbor on the board says Margaret claims you are falsifying government credentials and harassing her. She's pushing for immediate legal action against you." I squeezed my eyes shut, feeling the walls close in. They're moving faster than I expected. "There's more," Dominic whispered. "Margaret's brother-in-law just became a judge in the local court. Any guess who'd handle HOA disputes?" My doorbell rang, making me jump. Through the peephole, I saw Margaret with two men I didn't recognize. One holding a camera, the other carrying a folder stamped with the county seal. "Hello, neighbor," Margaret's voice oozed fake sweetness. "We have the building inspector here about those dangerous structural issues we reported with your property. We'll need full access right away." I texted Dominic quickly. "They're here with a fake inspector. Call your contact at the county now." Opening the door just enough to speak through the security chain, I smiled calmly. "Perfect timing. I was just speaking with Chief Inspector Williams about tomorrow's appointment. Would you mind waiting while I conference him in to verify your credentials?" The inspector glanced nervously at Margaret. I can come back later, actually." "I'll still need your name and badge number for my report," I pressed. They retreated quickly, Margaret's face twisted with rage. That night, I worked until dawn, scanning every document Dominic had provided, organizing financial records, and mapping out connections on my living room wall. Paper trails showed Margaret's sister receiving payments for services never rendered, board meeting minutes mysteriously altered, and property records revealing how they targeted 5 other homeowners before me, all of whom eventually sold under pressure. I smiled as I watched a young girl send her first perfect backhand across the court, met with cheers from her friends. Maybe Margaret had been right about one thing. A tennis court should be enjoyed.
She just never understood that it had to be done the right way. The final report sat on my desk, naming names all the way up to the Cedar County administration. Tomorrow, it would go public. Some battles had been won, but the fight against corruption was far from over. For tonight, though, I simply let myself enjoy the steady rhythm of tennis balls and the sound of laughter drifting through the warm evening air.